And CCB, you want to share how you have used HiFlex?
Yeah, and I might do what Rudy did and share my screen in a second, but I'll just say, like Rudy, I teach face-to-face classes and I don't lecture as much because I teach a performance-based class. So the students are doing a lot of presentations, but that class is both teaching them to give presentations, but also to be interactive listeners. And a lot of students think like, oh, I just have to show up on my speech day. And then like, I'm done. I did what I was supposed to do, and they have a hard time like getting to class. Or I mean, I don't feel like that's fair. I have students who've had sick kids, who got trapped out of town, whose car broke down and just like couldn't get to class. And I was like, great, just let me know and I'll post a link to Zoom. So like I didn't start my class with the intention of it being HiFlex, but I always left that door open as a possibility. And so the first thing I think is the distinct difference between me and Rudy is that I was teaching at one of our rural locations. So I was teaching at the job spot which is in the Vallarta parking lot on Panama Lane. There are not cameras set up in that room. So I don't have someone tracking and following me. And sometimes the technology is not quite as sophisticated, but I do have, I allow my students to pre-record their speeches and upload them to Canvas Studio as an option. It's not required, it's not compulsory, but it's an option. And I have found using HiFlex, number one, to allow students who can't make it to class as a means to still interact. And number two, in the same way with Rudy, to record it so they can utilize it. If they missed anything, they can see what they missed. Worked really well. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. So I do it a little bit different than Rudy does. And so in my Canvas course, if I have a specific page, and on that page is where it says link to class recordings, and I post links to the classes. I don't do any editing myself. I record to the cloud and I post the links to the cloud, and I've noticed they disappear usually after like 3 or 4 months. They're just gone, which is fine for me. But there is a statement in my syllabus always to my students that I do record things, even my face-to-face class, that I record things and upload them on the class website, and they're not for any outside distribution or anything like that, because they are to help students who, even like, let's say you were in class that day and you just missed something and you're like, what was she talking about? I can say like, oh, that recording is posted online. And so I think, yeah, so this is an example. Right now you can see this is a student presenting from his own house live into the class with a live class audience watching it. And so he's controlling the screen. The people in the room have it projected, and he is like in his own house, and the student was sick and didn't want to share his sickness. So it just really was like a great alternative for everyone. And I think more than one student, there was another student, let's see, but you can see the students' faces, and you can hear them. And then sometimes you can see me when I'm explaining things. Wow, I look really confused. But I just wanted to show like that's how, like, then we're moving into an activity. I don't do any editing on my part. It's completely like raw. And I just am using the Zoom cloud feature, and then posting the recordings into my Canvas. And I'm not in a fancy classroom that helps me allow like all of that is done very bare bones. I've been in scenarios where I couldn't get the like technology to work in the classroom. So I used my phone or my personal laptop and was just able to turn the Zoom on. The downside of that is I can't have the same materials projected on the board, but I can allow students who are connecting remotely to still be engaged. And I use the chat boxes really aggressively when I'm doing that. Like when I ask the class if there's questions, then I go over to the classroom and I check the chat box. Are there any questions? And also normally I put them in like groups, pair shares, and like, let's think about what we just did. And it's so nice because with the online students, I just put them in a breakout room. And with the face-to-face students, I walk around and check on them. And then I check on the one breakout room, and then we report out. So it really has worked, but I think you have to have taught on Zoom a lot in order to balance that effectively, because I've noticed like in some of the workshops I've been in, like folks they panic when they're sharing the screen and managing the chat box. And if you're not used to doing all this, and even though I'm used to it, it can still be a lot. Like if I have really deeply engaged online students and students who need a lot of help in person, like it can be a lot for, I wish I had like a TA that was like monitoring one or the other. But thankfully that class, I have to say also, in that class, it was an 8-week accelerated course. It started with 30 students. Actually, I had extra people trying to add, and we broke down to about 19. And I would say about out of those 19, about 6 of them stopped coming face to face because they had some kind of personal crisis. And so I really was able to hold on to that like 20% of the class by allowing the high flex scenario to exist. Sorry, that's a lot of information.
No, that's really helpful. And so, what kind of tips do you have for managing that? Because, it can be difficult to manage when folks want to engage in the chat on Zoom and then face to face is a different engagement. So, do you have any suggestions for managing that?
So a big one I would say is that I used to hand out little slips of paper as a response form in class. A lot of the people in my department call them love notes of like positive things to write people. I turned that into a form. And I allowed students to use their phones to fill it out live in class. And so the students in class are listening because they're filling out the form. And the students live online, they have the link to the form in the chat box, and everyone is engaging. And then I allowed all the content of those forms to populate a Google Doc. And I just post the link to the Google Doc in the students' feedback. So in real time, they're getting feedback from all their classmates and from me that are live physically in the class and online. And that process also slowed everything down a little bit. So I didn't feel like all the pressure was on me. Like I could still be grading or interact with a student who needed help. So anything that's like keeps the online and face-to-face students like occupied, engaged, and in the learning environment, and doesn't require me to be constantly, helping them. It's a lot of work on the back end to set up, but I will never not do it now. Like I love it because that's been my number one thing that helps. Yeah.
Right. And that removes you as being the one mediator, and it kind of decentralizes it so that and that's, if you look at the high flex pedagogy and recommendations, that's a super user that you're thinking about ways in which you can leverage technology to facilitate interactions across, no matter what modality. So that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, CCB. Does
Okay.
anybody have any questions for CCB?
Do you ever have any, I guess, any slack, any, I guess, any, how good is your communication, I guess, between the students that are online and the ones that are in person or is there like a delay? Is that something that you have to deal with?
So I'm almost like embarrassed to admit this on something that's being recorded, but I will. One day there was a really bad accident and I'm always early. And so I wasn't early. And then when I got there, students were texting me because they were like, "Hey, we can't make it." So I started the Zoom like 3 minutes late. And people were, I mean, it was like 8:03, but the students were just so panicked because I'm always there. But I use text message to interact with my students a lot. That's my primary modality of communication. So like in the morning, I wouldn't automatically start a Zoom. I would tell people, if you want the Zoom, text me and let me know you're not going to be there and I'll start a Zoom, which like towards the end of the semester, I just started doing it every class because there was a couple students I just knew. But when it first started, I was like, I'm not going to, for funsies, record every single class. It's extra work. If you guys need it, you need to justify and just like stay in touch with me. And so I think setting that expectation that like, if this is something you want, I need you to justify and I need you to participate. And I do, there was one point where I like, one of the students got kind of snippy about like, "Oh, well, you should just start it every day." And I was like, this is an extra thing I'm doing for you. It's not something that I owe you. And it's hard when you sometimes have to set those boundaries with students. But like that was, I mean, that one snippy comment was like the only time. Everyone else was like super, super grateful. And like it made everyone's life so much better. I had moms who like were driving their kids to school and would like be on the Zoom watching class, listening to class while they were driving there. So I think for me, because my communication with my students is so, I hate to use the word aggressive. I'm a lot, but my students are used to that. So it hasn't really been a problem. I get good questions. I get good interaction, and I really love more than anything. I have to tell you, Rudy, I'm sure you experience this too. When people are like, hey, I missed class. What did I miss? And I'm like, watch the video. Watch the video and then let me know what your questions were. Like I love that. And then I love when students are like, I'm still confused. And I'm like, I can see that you still haven't watched the video. In fact, you haven't logged into Canvas. So I actually think it helps me hold students more accountable because I don't mind if they miss. I want to help them. I want to give them everything. But like that doesn't mean that they get to like disrespect my time or their class materials or their classmates. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? I feel like I went a little bit off
No, it's great. Thank you. I
track there.
appreciate that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful because I think one of the fears with high flex is that students will just not show up. And so I think that CCBU pointing out that it holds students more accountable to learn the material and to work through the class, I think that's a really helpful insight.